Right. Welcome to XPC Talks. So we're very excited to have David Harden share about his experiences in programming and building a practice and just being all sorts of innovative physician. David and I met back last year, or maybe about a year ago, when he was helping out as faculty for clinicians who code boot camps that we were running, which some of you I actually met through that adventure as well. And David, I'll hand it off to you. Tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and then you can jump into your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Paulius. Yeah, we met through Clinicians Who Code. Andrew Hines, I think, put some of that stuff together. I did a module on SQL for that, or SQL, or Squeal, depending on what you want to call it. Um, and so, yeah, it's been fun to get to kind of respond to some bat signals that have been put out there on, like, hey, who are these, kind of smart clinical people that are also pretty tech literate and wanting to dive in even deeper. And the rest of the introduction I'll get to in the presentation. All right. So, real quick, David Harden, like I mentioned, try to keep it to the point on kind of where we're going. Good to meet everybody. I'm from this Oregon Trail generation, is like I like to call it. So, had an Apple II is maybe some of my first experiences with computing, and a lot of my hypothesis is there's a lot of digitally native clinicians in this age that have untapped clinical skills and untapped technical skills to go with them. Um, and so that's where my thought is, how do I use some of that to enable the clinical operations? So my actual initial pre-med path had nothing to do with medicine. Didn't know I was going to be a doctor until I called an audible about halfway through college. Had already been exposed to kind of the business, the quantitative side of things, but did some research with an OBGYN as an undergraduate. And he had been an electrical engineer before going to medical school. And I'm like, hey, I like how this guy thinks. I kind of like this little different way of working with people and solving problems. Maybe this med school thing's for me. So went on to do that. Did from Birmingham, Alabama, went to UAB Medical School. Then also did internal medicine residency, and through training was actually exposed to primary care sports medicine and got to work with Alabama and the Crimson Tide. And that kind of pointed me towards eventually doing a fellowship in sports medicine after internal medicine. I really liked that it was a very quantitative, very tech enabled field. And they have GPS and all this kind of stuff on the players, especially at the time. So that's kind of what continued to send me down that path. Came out and worked in private practice in a couple different settings. Pre-COVID, was primarily in kind of an urgent care setting during COVID, and through the tail end of that, had a patient that kind of put me in touch with this guy who was a PhD in exercise science, Dr. Cody Hahn. And so me and him co-founded this kind of unique concierge type practice where we folded in the things I knew from my experience with sports medicine and how we handled athletes, looking at them from a biomechanical standpoint, looking at them from a physiologic standpoint, sometimes doing more advanced labs or just more testing than you would normally do in a traditional fee for service setting, really with the goal to optimize. You're wanting to do some job, you're not wanting to just be less sick. So how do we make you, in the case of sports, a better keeper in soccer, or a better quarterback in football? So we fired that off, me on a part-time basis, kind of for the past few years, and then now full-time, starting in January. So I do kind of a mix of the clinical, the traditional, almost like a direct primary care chassis there, and then tag team with him, and we have a PhD nutritionist to figure out. Okay, I'll figure out clinically if you're okay. Now, what's your optimal exercise program need to look like? Okay, now what's your dietary intake need to look like to achieve, whatever overall goal you're shooting for? And on the clinical side, if there's something that's wrong, if you get high blood pressure, we were running into on the outside world, personal trainers or somebody would find this and they wouldn't know who to talk to, or they just would ignore it. So let's have the physician integrated. So as stuff that's more purely in the medical domain comes up, we've got ways to handle that. But then you don't want me dialing in your exercise program. I can give you some pretty good thoughts, but I don't have a PhD in that. And there's really I've come to appreciate the science that is nutrition as well, as far as like meal timing, meal planning, um, adjusting around the training cycles people have, really goal directed nutrition therapy in a lot of ways. So all that is what we've been doing, and figuring out how to leverage all that additional capacity to get better outcomes in primary care. Because, we think of this as a specialized type practice. Um, but there's really some trends in primary care that I think are going to lend more towards advanced methods. The model is going to be different. We're not even totally sure what the model is going to look like, but the model is going to be different. So, talk about some of those trends. We'll get into some of the nitty gritty of the operation, how we target certain things, how we test them, what the take homes are for certain patients, and then how we use tech. I saw a lot of the question responses, like, "Hey, if you had all these coding skills, what would you do?" Okay, I won't say I'm super duper expert level developer, but having a lot of those tools in my belt, here's some of the ways that I use them, and places people could get started. So as far as trends, Bain had this interesting analysis that they released. That's kind of their. It was a two-part thing. So they released one maybe a couple of years ago on where they thought primary care was going to be in 2030, and then just last year they released one that's like, hey, actually, it's different than that, even more so. So non-traditional providers, 30% or more, come 2030 was their kind of updated estimate. Now, as far as what advanced primary care, what retail, what concierge, what payer owned all mean, well, I know what payer owned means, but as far as what this actual mix is, that I think that's more up for debate. But what I kind of believe is, regardless of the mix, for better or for worse, traditional fee for service primary care is going to be less of a role in the market, just from all sorts of different pressures. Unless something material changes between now and then, that seems to be kind of whittling away. Um, you know, Kind of outside of the scope of this, but insurance has been a big part of changing reimbursement models there. It's just playbook that we used for the past 20, 30, 40 years isn't going to work necessarily the next couple decades. So we're seeing a big growth in these non-traditional models already. A lot of times they do end up being cash pay or membership based. There's the whole DPC movement that's out there, but then there's kind of all these different labels that we want to give it: longevity medicine, integrative medicine, functional medicine, all trying to get around patients that want to find an alternative to, okay, I see my doc once a year for an annual physical. He maybe does some labs and I call him when I'm sick. But it doesn't offer a whole lot more than that. And that's what I think these alternative practice models are trying to do. And I think you can get some better outcomes by doing it that way. So kind of our model is taking a full 360 look at everything. Berman had this good analysis on systemic chronic inflammation, and where all the sources of that come from. For our purposes, it's really just looking at the different domains of health and what it means to be a human in a lot of ways. You got external and internal factors, and they kind of can be covered by either the domain of medicine, is it the domain of exercise science, is it the domain of nutrition? It's how you're working, what you're doing, and what's going into your body, either directly or indirectly. And so we try to tackle all these one way or another with an individual or a combined effort. So what do we measure? I kind of make the joke that, well, it's all math at the end of the day. I say that a lot just in operations and talking to people, because math is just applied math is everything. So if you kind of moneyball it a little bit, if you're trying to get someone to lose weight, that's a function of how many calories they're taking in, how many calories they're putting out, and the function of how many calories they're taking in is all got a bunch of macros involved. Function of how many calories they're putting out depends on, if they're doing resistance training, if they're doing cardio, what heart rate zones they're at, how long they do it, how intense they do it. So that's where we try to figure out as much as practical on how to quantify the human being. So we use a few different pieces of machinery, but this kind of hits a lot of the big metrics that we try to hit as far as body comp, functionality, dietary intake. I would think most of these are fairly familiar to everybody. And then at the bottom, we do, none of this quantification matters if someone like has really bad right lower quadrant pain. Like, okay, who cares what your body comp is? Like, you've got appendicitis, so it's not going to matter if we don't fix that. So that's where having the physician involved is helpful. Um, and yeah, we just try to take a 360 view. So here's kind of some illustrations of why we chose those targets. The research is out there all sorts of different ways. Grip strength. We just see that mortality goes down as you get better grip strength. You got BMI, you got fat-free mass, you got fat mass. Broadly speaking, someone that's stronger, someone that has kind of the right amount of body fat, someone that's active, um, is gonna live longer and have a healthier life, as far as we can tell. Health span as much as lifespan. And so the other things on the medical side, we'll look at blood pressure because we do find some of these things that will sneak up on people uh, that we need to manage medically. We try to dial in the protein intake as well because that's where someone's maybe trying to put on mass, trying to optimize those things, but you're not eating enough protein. And then of course the VO2 max that's been published almost ad nauseum at this point. You dial a lot of these things in, and and maybe they're surrogates for even other things. Okay, grip strength. We're not going to just train someone's arms and not the rest of their body, but in large part, you optimize some of these metrics. They're good surrogates for everything else that's a nice marker of health. So, how do we get the data out of people? Similar to how I talked about, you don't want me dialing in your push-ups. Figuring out the nuances of some of this VO2 max. You don't want me putting someone on the stairmaster necessarily either. In the words of the great Hank McCoy, I'm a doctor, not an escalator. So the equipment that we use, resting metabolic rate, active metabolic rate, all these here, um, takes a little bit of domain expertise that these exercise physiology guys spend their whole PhD career doing. So that's why it's been really good for me to partner with Cody on that. And then there's just a few different pieces of equipment that you have to buy. So it's not just buying your stethoscope and your EKG machine like you'd normally outfit a clinic. There's a whole range of options on how you measure body comp, how you measure the VO2 max, what kind of mask you have, how tight the masks fit, the the software outputs of the machine. So that's where there's its own talk I could give on just how to choose a VO2 max machine. But knowing that, hey, these machines can make a big difference. It's just a matter of kind of choosing what all you want in your battery, getting set up with the right people and the right equipment to do that. And then we're continuing to, we've got kind of our standards, but new stuff's coming out all the time. So for our piece, and I'll tease on it now and talk about it later, exactly which pieces of tech we choose are important, but not the whole thing. Really, these kind of testing protocols is to enable some sort of take home message to the patient on how they need to change their life or how we need to help, make some big changes alongside them to pursue health and lifestyle goals there. So yeah, I'm interested to see how things develop on our ability to figure out correlations and heart rate variability and genetics and some of these other data, how much that moves the needle versus what we're already capturing. That's what we're really really interested in seeing that develop there. Not just genetics and genomics, but the proteomics. Okay, how do your genes guide the expressions of certain proteins in certain parts of your body to build muscle, reduce fat, change the epithelial lining of certain organs? That's where I think we're getting really down to basic science and getting interesting in some of these next developments. Um, And so we get all this data. What do we do with it? This is kind of an example workflow. We have a presentation that we give every patient that kind of goes through our big battery. And it will look something like this. So we'll kind of see where somebody's at on week one, um, get a lot of this different data that you see there, make some recommendations. And really, the value is not just, hey, here's what you need to do. We'll see you next year. It's, hey, here's what we need to do for this month. And let's figure out how to move the needle this month. Let's figure out what we want to measure and figure out what maybe a marker of success is in a short period of time. So, as we can get a tight feedback loop, we can change the behavior a lot quicker, and we can get a lot better outcomes, a lot better results on a consistent basis. We may not get none of this. Do we promise is ever a quick process? It's frankly, at the quickest, it tends to be a 6 to 12 month process. But maintaining patient engagement is sometimes so difficult if you don't have nice feedback loops, sometimes even some gamification of the process. No one had to pester someone to play Mario. That was built into the structure of the game. It just took care of itself. So the more we can give people that kind of feedback as far as, well, what's your score and how did you do on the last level and how many things do we need to redo again to get it better? The more we'll get people engaged, and the more they're engaged, the better the outcomes will be. This is a fairly tech heavy, or at least data heavy problem to solve on a lot of this stuff. I talked about all the quantification, talked about all the different testing sources. Unfortunately, if you have one BIA, body impedance analysis machine to check for body water and body fat, it's either got just some number you've got to read off the machine, or at best, it's got a USB connection to your laptop, and then maybe some desktop client that you use. There's not just one platform for every device that you get. Now, there are a lot of companies that have made big inroads on that as far as APIs for connecting a lot of different software platforms, a lot of different hardware services. But to date, like, there's always some hole that's going to happen regardless of whatever platform you get. And you think you get something set up real nice, and then suddenly something new comes out that you want to incorporate, and you're right back to square one. Oh, okay. Well, this API platform had these 10 things, but now we want to add this 11th one and it's not on the platform. So, okay. So that's where integrating all this stuff, there's just not an easy way to have someone do it for you that I've found. It just takes either some manual processes. Um, we wear out the Google Sheets sometimes, or at least we used to. And you can make some incremental change in buying some of it, but at the end of the day, sometimes you just gotta duct tape things together with some code. Um, and so that's kind of what our thought has been. Multiple platforms. How do you wrangle the data? And I get excited about coding, so I get conflicted if everyone on my floor is coding. It's both a good, it's Schrodinger's thing. It's both a good thing and a bad thing. But kind of our philosophy on why I'm spending, frankly, time that could be bringing in more revenue if I was more clinical. I'm spending it on the technical side because I think that is our core business function, is how do we integrate all this data to communicate, a patient's overall picture to them and improve their outcomes. So Joel on Software is a great blog that's not active anymore, but even stuff as old as 2001 has a lot of great insights there. And I liked his point there about, even within gaming development shops, some of them they're going to differentiate on plot, some of them they're going to differentiate on the cool features, and I think that's some good application for a lot of clinical businesses too. It's just a matter of choosing what's going to be your thing. And not everybody's thing may be tech and the data integration, but that's kind of what we're banking on here. And so some of the things, if you've got a Google Sheet, that's probably the first thing that I did a lot with. Have a Google Sheet, you have values in the sheet. Um, Google has something native called Google App Script that's just kind of a version of JavaScript, and you can get it to do all sorts of cool things as far as taking data out of your sheet, putting data in your sheet. You can even use that as a database. Um, There's reasons not to use Google Sheets as a database, but you can just do a lot with that. And so even one little tech skill in your back pocket, like, oh, I know how to use Google Apps Script, can suddenly integrate so much data across so many services and start to automate processes within your clinical workflows, within your business workflows. Because that's one of the things I did notice again on the LinkedIn, or excuse me, the Zoom responses is, hey, how do I integrate all this stuff? How do I use these AI tools? Um, ETL, you got to build a database sometimes. And again, each piece of software or hardware is going to have its own hooks that you're going to need to dig into. And then you get to what's the point? And again, it's all data visualization, data interpretation. How do we turn data into information, into insights, and then into behavior change? So right now, I don't have a ton of our own agents or predictive models, anything like that. Um, but that'll be kind of the next steps over the year, is figuring out once we've got enough data, and we've got a few hundred patients that have already come through our system. So there's some interesting data already in place on our side as far as seeing the weight trickle down, seeing body composition change, seeing metrics like VO2 max. So I'm excited to eventually start messing with that and figure out, hey, how can we predict some of these things um, with data that we didn't know was useful before? So here's one example of, I've at this point coded up 3 or 4 internal tools, maybe more. Um, this was Flask and the Flask templating engine. And then a little bit like Chart.js created all these charts. But the problem we were trying to solve here was our diet tracking app. We use Chronometer. It has an API that's pretty good. It has its own dashboard that's okay. But the dashboard it has didn't it just didn't match the workflow that I was using, and that in particular Cody and our nutritionist was using, on how do we communicate the calories over time? How do we see trends in some of this data? And how do we
Can I
match
grab
up?
one? Yeah. Thank you.
Um, how do we match up where someone's been and where they're going? And another theme on software is kind of off the rack versus bespoke. So we're not trying to build the best chronometer, the best diet tracking app for everyone to use. That's very valuable. Lots of great business in that. We just want to build the best one for us to use. So more of a bespoke suit. It may not be that valuable for any other business ever, but if it enables our business and we can build it in house and our operation works more efficiently because we've got a tool customized to us, then that's the value for the whole operation. That's really the integration piece more so than the technology piece on that. Like there's not a whole lot technically challenging to solve about how do you plot some points on a graph, but if you can plot the points on the graph that we want to use most efficiently for our business, that's where we can really get a lot of value out of it. So whatever's going on, it's going to change. Primary care definitely looks like it's headed in one direction or another that's going to be different from us now. Our strategy we kind of outlined there. Again, the integration is and the tech is really more valuable than ever, but also easy with AI to kind of get your foot in the door. You can talk with Chat GPT pretty quickly and get understanding about a lot of technical concepts and have it, you know, program your whole app in some cases. Um, but it's just a lot more accessible. You don't have to go to the bookstore and buy the JavaScript Bible and learn from that. Stack Overflow does exist, although really the LLMs have even taken over some of that role too. Um, but the nice part is you've got a lot of different things to choose from. So with all that, I think there's a meaningful opportunity in primary care. And to quote, paraphrase Patch Adams, I think this helps us to not just delay death and keep people less sick, but we can actually add value to their lives. Have somebody stronger, have somebody um, who's able to, pick up their grandkids when they weren't able to pick up their grandkids, have somebody that's better at whatever their sport is. If they're a CrossFitter, if they're a marathon runner. In my book, kind of that's the ultimate goal of medicine is how do we get people to get more quality out of their life and enjoy it more, and kind of use the tools we have to get them there. So um, we'll kind of open it up for Q&A, and I'll send it back to the group.
Yeah, this has been amazing, David. Thanks so much. That I actually learned quite a bit. So we have, I think, a good number of questions that from the RSVP that I'm looking at, and so uh, Ada, maybe I don't know if you're at a place where you can talk, but I think you asked an interesting question about health literacy and after visit summaries. I don't know if you recall that. Are you interested in if you can talk, give context to that? Because I know some people are commuting and doing other things while they're here. So if Ada is not in a place where she can talk, one question I had for you, David, is what do you find patients to be responding to the most in terms of some of these uh, data points that are not traditional, for regular PCP practice? Just are there trends that are emerging? Like, grip strength
Yeah,
is not a usual one to look.
right. So we definitely get a good response when I kind of show them the graph with all those different curves on there that says kind of here's where we want you to be. And, you know, most of the patients that we've come across have maybe had a blood pressure and maybe a cholesterol panel. And that's been the extent of things they think they need to optimize. And sometimes that's not even all that actionable for a patient to optimize. Okay, my cholesterol's off. Your feedback loop on a lipid panel is not great. Outside of the context of this, there's a lot of just understanding we're still developing on lipids. But then B, hey, my cholesterol's bad. Okay, you need to eat better. And then you find out in 6 months or so if you've eaten better, but you're not always aware of your day-to-day stuff that you did that affected your lipid panel, assuming your lipids are even, 100% correlated to your diet. Same idea with A1Cs a little bit for people that have diabetes. Blood pressure is a little easier, but that's actually tends to be more of a passive thing because a lot of times we're giving someone a pill and saying, "Hey, take this and see if your blood pressure goes down." It's really us doing something for the patient as opposed to the patient changing a ton of health behaviors. Yes, there's the diet and the exercise piece that goes along with blood pressure, but again, the feedback loop is not as tight there. Whereas we can get with weight, with calorie intake, especially with the diet tracking, we can get real tight feedback loops because that changes on a day-to-day basis. We do incorporate CGMs on a decent chunk of patients too, especially for making a dietary intervention. And of course, that's minute by minute feedback loops there. And then grip strength is one that they can kind of train to, and it doesn't change as fast, but it can still change on a couple week type basis, depending on where somebody was at on a muscular standpoint. Um, and then VO2 max is one that we really like. Feedback loops are just longer on that. It usually takes about 12 weeks. Sometimes in a month we can get a meaningful change if someone was pretty bad, out of shape. Um, and so all those just inform like here's where you're at, for better or for worse. Now you at least know, and now we've got things that we can do that can move the needle on those numbers.
Super helpful. All right, Ada is back, I think. So
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, excellent presentation, David. I really enjoyed it. My my kind of background question that Paulius is referring to was, um, and you mentioned it a little bit in your talk, was this gamification of patient participation in their own healthcare and being able to ascertain kind of where they are with their own understanding of their health. And then as you work with them, being able to have something that they can easily reference in order to continue to engage in their health. And so, this kind of tight feedback loop that you were describing, and what sort of techniques from a technical standpoint can we, make these kind of tools so that patients can really engage? And the question actually came more from my stepson, who's been suffering through a injury. He's a decathlete, and kind of does he gather information in a way that's very helpful to his own improvement or not? So that was the motivation behind um, that particular approach to that question that was put out there.
Yeah, and specifically, kind of what was the question?
Well, I'll read it for yeah, because it might have been a while when it was RSVP. So it was yeah, how to gamify the assessments of patients' health literacy and create after visit summaries. Is there anything that you're doing that is maybe interesting, or because I'm just to add my 2 cents is like this is probably some of the lowest hanging fruit that I've seen out there for traditional practices to utilize Gen AI and like create poems for kids, discharge summaries to
Mhm.
understand like how to take meds or whatever, right? Like and this is kind of what I've been observing. Are you, experimenting with any of that yet?
Yeah, that's all been a relatively manual process for us so far. I kind of hinted at the little outline take home that we would give people on that. That's the 10,000-foot view for a lot of patients. We also give sub reports. AVSs, yes, I did plenty of them in the traditional world. It's a little bit of an artifact of the system now that we don't really do as much in kind of our practice as a formal AVS, but we will have, hey, we did an active and arresting metabolic rate on you today. Here's what your numbers were. Here's where your targets are. Here's how, and we'll even categorize people as far as, um, below average. We try to soften the language as best we can, but in general, it's kind of a below average, very below average, and then there's an average and an elite, and we have about 5 categories on that front that will try to translate, hey, what does this number even mean? Um, and then what do you do about it? So our after visit summer maybe one of the machines we use is a tonal exercise machine, and that can help guide weights that people need to use in their workout routines. And AVS for us may be, here's your next 4 weeks of exercise programming, and here's what we'd expect to. Here's what your starting weights are. Here's a range of what your weights might be after that. So um, I think the next step to automate some of that is it's easier now than ever to pipe that into some text field, fire it off to whichever LLM you choose with kind of a prompt of, hey, here's some data. I'm a clinician. Please summarize this and have a take home for the patient. And I think it could do a pretty good job. So, yeah, lots of opportunity on kind of a post visit summary. Depends on your cadence of visits. We try to solve for that with a lot more visits, and a lot tighter feedback loops. But if you're more spread out, I think you could just be more all encompassing in what you do during the visit and how big you make your summary after the fact.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
Um, David, thanks for the talk. I think it's quite interesting the approach you're taking in terms of applying technology across the entire spectrum, from workflows internal to your practice to engaging with patients. I'm curious, and maybe this is like sort of a corollary on Ada's question. How are you thinking of where you're focusing your attention as you're applying technology? Are you thinking of it more like deepening, integrating different data sources? Are you thinking of it then at the layer of integrating those data sources into consumable, outputs for patients? I'm thinking of some of the approaches that Newman's taken for behavioral change as a way to kind of
Mhm.
apply a lot of those techniques that we use in gaming, but apply them to incite, behavioral change modification. So I'm curious, like, where's your head at from a technology perspective? There's a lot of places you can apply your skill set. You've obviously done a lot on the data integration side. You've done a lot at the provider sort of workflow side. Like, where is your head at across those?
Yeah. So what we're slowly but surely piecing together for internal use is just a um, provider side dashboard that has one giant database on everything that we know about a patient one way or another. And we can use that on our side to kind of see where they're at. And that's, yeah, primarily a data integration problem. And then on the patient facing side, hook up a slightly different front end to the same database and have it show views specific to them on where they are and where they need to go. That's kind of the phase we're in right now. Before we start gamifying it even very much, before we start even doing a whole lot of predictive modeling, let's just show you where you are in an easy to access way. A kind of a custom app for the practice. Um, at least when I was in the system, so to speak, you got whatever patient portal you had, but that was sometimes awful cumbersome for everybody to work with. And so not trying to make the best patient portal that everybody can use, but make kind of an opinionated one on how to just communicate the data with the patient, coming off more of the manual processes, and having, as much as we can, a tight feedback loop where they can log in and they can see, what are my action items for today? And just that level of communication, I think, is going to get us pretty long way. Once we got that stood up, is where it would be interesting to figure out, okay, is there some sort of point system, and a patient needs to log their workout in this way or another way that gives them some feedback. I've got a friend at a company called Fetch Rewards that does, you scan your receipt, and it uploads all that data for the company to give you discounts and coupons. And he's the PM specifically, product manager specifically for how the button interacts with a customer in the app. So I know you can just go to the nth degree on how much haptic feedback somebody gets, how many times it chimes, you know, and being a little careful of what we can do versus what we should do. The nice part with health behaviors is we have good outcomes we can point them to. If you're a casino or a data tracking app, maybe there's nefarious uses there. But all that to say, I do make the joke that we need to trick people into being healthy sometimes. And so some of that is, how do we present the data in a way that highlights what their problem is and highlights what they can do to make it better. So that's what we're going to be developing now, without any gamification, just being, here's where your weight is. Here's what the calories have been on average for this week. Here's what we would expect your weight to do if you take your calories to this level. And doesn't even predictive modeling. There's just equations out there that speak to that. So that's kind of the next step we're on there.
Awesome. Um, Yolanda, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but I'm gonna go to you next, if in case you feel like adding context, and or if you want to ask the question that you wrote about improving care coordination and adherence to guidelines. Because what I was thinking, since you're in residency, like we always rely on evidence-based stuff, and some of the stuff that David's doing is, it's not an AFP or, like Family Medicine Society journals, and not yet. I think there's obviously a spectrum of um, what has efficacy, and like I don't think you mentioned 3D body scans, not like full body MRIs, right? Right. So kind of curious, Yelena, if you want to add some more context to that question, or maybe you were gonna take it in a different direction.
Yeah, I actually had a comment and a question, and to be totally honest, I actually uh, wasn't sure what I was signing up myself up for, and I didn't even, I didn't know the context of the talk today, so that was just a general thing that I've been thinking about for a while, basically like unifying uh, guidelines, just because I know, having worked, well, I mean, I'm 8 months into my intern year, having rotated across a million different hospitals in Boston. Attendings always have their sort of specific ways, where like some attendings like to use these guidelines and others like to use those. And I always was just curious, as a med student, why don't we just unify or collate all these guidelines and find the overlap between them? And that's probably, you know, the best consensus to date, kind of thing. But that's more of like, I don't know, it's like a medical education thing that I've been just thinking about, and maybe uh, now that I just started on internal medicine rotation now, and so I was thinking maybe I'll use that as a little playground or toy project over the next month or so, um, to compete with update a little bit. But with regards to what we're talking about today, I was curious, David, if you've heard of Whoop. They
Oh
make these
yeah.
heart rate bands. Yeah, yeah. So I've had one for a while. They're startup based in Boston. They're pretty big now. But what you were talking about as far as like building an agent to kind of uh, process all this data in a nice, human friendly interface, they have integrated an LLM feature where you can basically, chat with the an agent to talk about your physiologic data. In this case, it's usually like, accelerometer, heart rate based, but it seems to work like, relatively well. Um, and then I was curious, from your guys' standpoint, I understand you're integrating with a lot of different devices, different hardware, different software and data sources. Um, because I spend a lot of my time these days thinking about how to get structured output from LLMs, presumably with an unstructured input. How much of that is a problem where you have to basically do, the equivalent of medication reconciliation, but for data reconciliation and
Yeah.
making sure, you can
Yeah.
unify all that data.
Right. I like that concept, data reconciliation. Um, and sometimes you get some data allergies too. But
Yeah.
that's right now. It's been kind of manually coding up ETL or extract transform load jobs where, okay, the data comes out of this API in this shape. Hopefully it always comes out consistently in a shape if it's an API. Change it into whatever shape via hard code and then spit it out in the shape that we want in our data. We have a massive Postgres database that I built. Um, and so that's right now doesn't use any AI. It used my natural intelligence to write a bunch of code, but didn't fool with a whole lot of structured in, structured out. Well, thankfully, it's all structured in, structured out by design on the front end.
Mhm.
I do think, particularly with diet, yes, you can do diet tracking and it's all structured, but diet tracking just kind of sucks. Like, there's no way to make it all that fun. There's always some friction there. That's the one where we found the most friction because you have to scan a barcode or you have to do something. Um, the more we can get that where people can just give us data in an unstructured form, and then we can handle the structuring on the back end, I think we'll be able to close that feedback loop a lot better. And that's been an interesting one to see, just the variation in patient behavior. Some people love logging their food. Like, we have some people that log down to the cough drop that they eat on a daily basis, and those people are great. And then some people, that scatter plot I showed, it'll have a whole bunch of holes in it for weeks at a time, and we're like, well, what'd you eat there? And we just can't get any data that way. So the more, I think a good use of LLMs and structured outs is going to be just reducing the friction in data collection, um, because so much of it is just a pain for patients to engage with. Not in our patient population skews. We have some people in their 60s, but it definitely skews younger, skews my generation. Um, and maybe some Gen X in my generation, but it's people that are comfortable with that. And to start moving the needle at all as you apply any of these kind of concepts to a Medicare value-based care arrangement, you know, how much are people in their 80s really going to interact with a phone app that scans barcodes, and has a lot of little data points on a fairly small phone screen? So I think that's where, as much as we can reduce friction in collection and communication,
Mhm.
LLMs have a big opportunity there that you just can't easily do with hard coded methods.
And
Yeah, no, and it's funny because I was literally just reading about this like 10 minutes before joining the call about like routers and, then sort of new software architecture stack of LLM and RAG apps. Um, I could see a world where you could have essentially like self fine-tuned based on the user prompts on effectively their level of uh like interaction with the model, as far as
Right,
if they're
right.
going to just dictate this long log of, well, today I did this and I did that, versus someone who might enjoy a more like pedantic or more structured log of, lunch, colon, et
Right.
cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, just meeting
Um,
people where they're at. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But thanks.
Yeah. David, do you utilize any camera-based diagnostics? So right now, like there are tools to measure blood pressure from, like selfies, and then with food tracking, right? Like there you can supposedly estimate calories based on pictures and all of that.
Right. So, and yeah, we can wade into some of the specifics of technologies, what we, opinions on what's out there and what we do and don't use. So for picture based stuff, I haven't fooled with the picture based blood pressure yet. Primarily because most of our people can get an Omron and check it at home, and that hasn't been a big friction point. We have used picture based body comp some, and then we use something called the Human Track. That's a company called Vald that does a lot of anatomy and physiology measurement, and it does joint range of motion and joint force asymmetries based on motion capture. That thing has been awesome. It's something I picked up in sports medicine. At least Vald is Nordboard is one of the first things they came out with. They use it all the time in football and soccer for hamstring asymmetry and predicting risk of ACL and hamstring tears. Um, so they have a piece of technology that's called Human Track. It does motion capture. It's picture based. It's spectacular for figuring out, if someone when they try to squat down on one leg is off balance, and we have some asymmetry there. Sprin is the one that we've used the most for body composition. You just take a picture of yourself, and it does a pretty decent job at figuring out, percent body fat, even weight and BMI to some degree. Um, the food we've tinkered with some of the food ones, and at least as of 3 or 4 months ago, not great results. And that's a tough problem to solve. I mean, sometimes even determining if it's a steak or a baked potato, they're both brown and they're both about the same shape. Like that's just a tough AI problem. People have probably seen the picture that's a whole bunch of blueberry muffins and then a whole bunch of little Chihuahua dogs. Like, I get it. That's a tough one. Um, and then past that, I'm trying to think if there's any more picture or video devices. The on the 3D scan, that's something called a Fit 3D scan, and it's more traditional motion capture type thing where you stand on a platform. It's got two, I think they're actually the same cameras they use in like an Xbox or a PlayStation. Um, and it takes pictures of you as you spin around, and it comes up with a 3D avatar. And it can where we actually use that one the most is not so and it'll do body comp and it'll do weight, but over time patients can actually see the before and after very clearly. They can see their gut suck in, they can see their chest get bigger. Um, that's where we can really illustrate the physique changes. And you can do that with pictures, that's fine. Um, but it feels a little more Star Trekky, and it just hits a little harder if we have this nice little avatar that we can spin around for people and see, what kind of changes they've made. And hey, here's your measurements now. You're gonna have to buy some more clothes. Because it gets down to like what your bicep and your right calf and all that stuff is as far as those circumferences. So that's kind of the imaging based stuff that we use the most of.
Yeah, very cool. Well, David, huge thank you for doing the talk. I think we can pause here. I'll stop the recording and